Now it's time to talk about obedience. And I hope you had a chance to read what the book says about Milgram's experiment, the article about Milgram's experiment, and I hope you had a chance to watch the video. I know the video is very long, but it's really worth it. It's especially powerful to watch these individuals reacting in being videotaped while they're doing the experiment. So let's talk Milgram. So you saw how the Milgram experiment was set up. Funny story, we actually criticized Milgram for the experiment, of course, but also for the use of the word experiment because it's not technically an experiment. There was never a control group. But to give you a little background on Stanley Milgram, he was Jewish and he was incredibly distraught over what happened during the Holocaust. And he was sort of obsessed with that as a social psych researcher. What would make the Nazis commit the atrocities? He was also influenced by the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who was a captured Nazi and was tried for war crimes. And Eichmann repeatedly said, I was only following orders. I was only following orders. He used that as his defense, which, by the way, is never been successfully used as a defense. And so that's kind of what planted this seed in Milgram's head. He actually, and probably why he called it an experiment, was he wanted, I think, maybe the United States to serve as a control group. He was going to do this experiment here in the US. And of course, he anticipated seeing that maybe a fraction of a percent of people would follow orders and go all the way to the lethal shock of 450 volts. He was then, with these wonderful results, anticipating that Americans would not conform. He was going to then take his experiment to Germany, where he anticipated they would have lots of obedience. And then he was going to be able to come out with the statement that it's just something about Germans. They're more obedient. There was discussion of perhaps they have an obedience gene that Americans don't have. Well, as you know from reading and watching, that Stanley Milgram learned all he needed to know right here. He never took that experiment to Germany because he discovered, much to his dismay, at least in his experiment, the majority of participants went all the way to the lethal shock of 450 volts. 67%, in fact. If you look at this is just a nice little graph that shows the increasing shock level and the percentage of the subjects that were still obedient. And there are along the bottom what the shock machine said, and it points at which significant things happened. At 150, the learner complains of pain. A little bit above that, they plead to be let out. And as these ever-increasing protests from the learner, who is just a Confederate, occur, we see more and more people would refuse to participate and would drop out. But you can see that when we hit about 375 up to 450, we're still at that about 63, 65% of the individuals, of the subjects who delivered what they believed ultimately to be a lethal shock. This experiment was replicated in 2009, and overall they had similar results. The major alterations were made to the experiment for ethical reasons, obvious ethical reasons. As you can see in the video, the subjects were definitely upset, though we notice the laughter, which is an unusual response. There is also a good deal of angst that they're expressing. They want to quit, but this other person is telling them in a perfectly calm voice that they must continue. So what they did, and that's really where the ethical problem comes in, is they just put these poor subjects through too much emotional turmoil for it to be repeated. So what Brown did was have a very similar setup The only difference was each shock that got worse and worse and worse, they actually stopped at 150 volts for ethical reasons. Now, obviously, we're talking about different subjects. We're not comparing apples to apples, and many decades have passed since Milgram's initial experiment. But just looking at men and using the similar sample size that Milgram did, Milgram had 83% of his subjects reaching the 150 volt mark, while Brown in the early 2000s only had 67% reaching the 150 volt mark. Again, we're not comparing going all the way to 450 because that's unethical. So Milgram spent a good deal of time exploring the conditions that breed obedience. One of the big ones is how literally close the victim was. He had, in the one that's the most famous example, the victim was in another room, but they could hear the victim screaming for help. We could see that the greatest obedience actually happened when the learner couldn't be seen and couldn't be heard. There was one condition where he had them like knock on the wall, but there was no screaming in pain. There was no please stop, I have a heart condition kind of thing. He did some variations of his experiment where he had the learner in the same room, and of course obedience did drop when the physical distance of the learner becomes smaller. The learner becomes closer to you, and only 40% of those individuals went to 450 volts. In a really extreme version, he would have the teachers force the learner's hand onto the shock machine. They had to hold it down to deliver the shock. And of course, at that level, even fewer went all the way to 450, but we still see 30%. That's really, really disturbing. Some real life examples that relate to the emotional distance of the victim have to do with how we fight war today. Bombs are dropped remotely from hundreds of thousands of miles away. We're bombing with drones. The victims are emotionally distant from us, and it's much, much easier to kill under such circumstances. Also, another thing he looked at was how legitimate is the authority figure, that person standing in the room saying calmly, you must continue. He did some variations, one where he had the person who says you must continue on the telephone and directing the subject to continue delivering the shocks. When they were on the telephone, only 21% went all the way to 450 volts. What's funny about that is a lot of them lied and said that they went all the way. Only 21% actually did, but a significant number said, oh yeah, I did. I went all the way to 450, and they were just lying to the experimenter over the phone. They had another scenario where the Confederate, they had a partner for the subject, when the Confederate said, let's increase the shocks, no authority figure in the room, and he just kind of goes rogue and increases the shock level, 80% of those individuals refused to comply. It got so extreme, the one guy even picked up and threw the Confederate across the room. For the sake of time on these videos, I'm going to stop here and we'll pick up the next one talking about this very disturbing study done by Hoffling in 1966.